Thanks so much for the introduction, and thanks for the invite in the first place. So I was surprised to find out that my last EAGX talk was in 2016, so 7 years ago. That might surprise you too, given my appearances. Back then I looked 15. I think I made it to a solid 17. But I'm not, in fact, giving a talk on life extension research or rejuvenation. Instead, I was invited to talk about technical biosecurity and the way we approach this topic at Convergent Research, my organization. So given that the theme of this talk is getting things done, or this conference, I am going to focus quite concretely on the technologies that we're thinking about and how we work on them, rather than the philosophy and cost prioritization and expected value calculation. I'll assume that you're already bought into that. And so I will first speak a little more broadly about how we approach technology development at Convergent Research, and then talk more concretely about far ultraviolet light, which is one particularly promising technology for addressing future pandemics and making us more prepared across the board. And so if you're anything like me, when you think about technology development and scientific exploration, you have this idealized picture in mind of what it should look like ideally. We would first look at where we want to get on this dependency graph, this technology tree that you might recognize from Sid Meier's Civilization. And then we would backward chain from that and take a look at what is easy, what is hard, what is dangerous, what is safe, and go through the path that seems most rate limiting and also most compelling and potentially beneficial. And so I've been thinking about this for quite a while now at various places, mostly in the context of AI and nanotechnology. And the best takes that I've heard on this topic generally, and the best mentorship that I've received, were from this guy down below, Adam Marblestone, who is now my boss and CEO of Convergent Research, who has been thinking about how to approach technology development more strategically, particularly in the context of neurotechnology and nanotechnology, but also more generally. So the reality, rather than being this nice, deliberate process where we look ahead and choose what we should do, is much more chaotic and self-assembling, and is determined by the sort of two key systems that we have for science and engineering, which is, of course, academia and then the private markets. And so academia is not very well suited for this long-term planning. You see this poster from, or picture from the annual meeting of neuroscientists, where thousands of people assemble every year, and each of them presents their own research. And what you might notice is there's a basically one-to-one mapping between the researcher and the topic. And this is the typical scale on which academia operates. You are incentivized to publish your own original research in order to advance and get your tenure track, get your citations. And if there is a low dollar to citation ratio, like in a complex systems engineering project, odds are that academia won't address it. Similarly, in industry, in the private markets, there are incentive problems. So industry, startups, large labs are great at assembling coordinated teams that work on a concrete problem for a prolonged period and have a long-term strategy. But the space of goals that they can choose is filtered by a simpler criterion, which is do these projects generate a return on investment on a reasonable timescale? And you have to justify them to either venture capitalists or your shareholders if you're a larger company. And so, in reality, the the way we approach DTD, differential technological development, looks a little bit more like this, much more scattered, much more chaotic, and we see how it plays out in technologies like AI and biosecurity. So Adam and I, to some extent, have been thinking about how to solve these incentive problems, and whether there's a way to complement these systems with something that solves the coordination problems that could lead us to a longer-term strategic approach. And what we've been inspired by when we both worked at DeepMind, particularly Adam, is something you've probably heard of, which is AlphaFold, and how DeepMind managed to outcompete both academia and, interestingly, the pharma industry in solving the prediction of tertiary protein structure from the nucleic acid sequence. And the way they did this was very different than what you would normally see in academia. There was a professional coordinated team of 10 to 20 people that single-mindedly focused on this goal for years without publishing anything in the meantime. And the results were quite staggering. And this made Adam think about whether a model like this could be applied to some of the fields where there are these engineering problems that could provide infrastructure for broad acceleration that are just not incentivized in the current systems. And so the concrete way he operationalized this was with this concept of a focused research organization. Those are organizations that have a finite duration of 5 to 7 years, typically. Could be a little less on the margins. Importantly, a specified quantifiable goal and intermediate milestones to make sure that they are on track to achieve their North Star. And often a transition plan as to how the technology is going to be used in the world after being developed. I say technology, sometimes it is a scientific data set. I'll talk about that more later. We filter for things that are relatively deep in the technology stack rather than straight engineering build-outs. And the organization part is pretty clear. I think it's a bit of a misnomer because we often do development, so I prefer Frodo to Fro. And Adam has since had some success in selling this vision to some major funders, and managed to start his own nonprofit where I currently work. We mainly work with Eric Schmidt and his foundation, which, for context, is like somewhat bigger than OpenPhil and has non-EA money, but we have relatively large liberty to focus on the problems that we think are most impactful. So we focus on finding problems that fit the shape of the focused research organization, too big for a single lab, can be solved by a multi-lab coordination, and are not directly profitable in the market. This didn't convert well from Keynote, but what this is supposed to say is that the typical FRO is on the scale of $50 million over 5 years, which, depending on where you come from, might seem like a lot, but compared to like really big science projects like the Human Genome Project, is actually not that large of an amount. So you have to be very strategic about which bottleneck you try to approach. And yeah, this is how we think about the problems we choose, where the goal is to sort of hit the domino that is going to cause a chain reaction down the line. The concrete context in which Adam thought about this was neuroscience and the goal of mapping mammalian brains and down the line human brain. And what he noticed was that while many people are working on this problem, given current tools, there is not much of an incentive to develop the tools themselves that could scale up to the size of mammalian brains, and you can get at most to insect brains with current methods. And so this was actually the first focused research organization called E11bio that is developing optical and chemical tools that could scale well to true mammalian connectomes. And so how does this apply to biosecurity? The hypothesis is that there are many problems that fit this rough shape, where they are under-incentivized by the market, and that I think is quite a clear story for many of them, but also fall through the cracks in academia. We focus on interventions that are ideally pathogen agnostic or very broad. So there is a lot of focus on pan-coronavirus vaccines and broad measures that address the pathogens that we know, but we are trying to develop things that are robust to a lot of different scenarios and new viruses or bacteria that we might not be thinking about. So this is by no means an exhaustive list of categories, but generally those are things that make us react faster, protect us physically, or are kind of platform that can heal us in case we get infected. This is a list of some of them. Again, it's much longer in reality, and our current focus is primarily on two, where we apply this process of scientific road mapping, which is far ultraviolet light and metagenomics, and I'm going to focus on the first one. So far ultraviolet light, that is where, let's see if we can hear okay. So we won't be able to hear the expert. Donald Trump gave this amazing rambling speech about far ultraviolet light during COVID, and there were things that just didn't make sense, as is the case with the former president often. But there's one thing that we agree on, which is that the potential of ultraviolet light to inactivate viruses and bacteria in less than a minute, potentially in seconds, is something that we should be paying close attention to. And here I'm going to summarize mostly the work of my two colleagues, Vivian Belenky and Jesper Götting, who are applying this process of scientific road mapping, trying to look at the technology tree for far ultraviolet light. So what is far ultraviolet light? This is a surgical theater where surgeons will operate on a patient, and before the surgery, the room often gets sterilized by germicidal UV light. What you don't see in the room are people, for obvious reasons, because you don't want to get exposed to current germicidal UV. It's excellent at inactivating, killing bacteria and viruses, but it also tends to penetrate your skin and cause damage to your DNA that at the very least causes sunburn. In the higher wavelengths, it's definitely germicidal. It's debated whether 254 to 280 is carcinogenic. It's debated whether that's the case for GUV. But it was found that nature has a nice surprise for us, which is that in lower wavelengths, 200 to 235 roughly, UV light gets absorbed by the peptide bond, and therefore by proteins, and therefore by the dead layers on your skin, stratum corneum, and in the eye epithelium. And If that's true, it shouldn't cause any major health problems, and that also has panned out in many studies on models of human skin, on mice, and also on humans. Even after 1 year of continuous exposure or frequent exposure, no health effects have been found. So why aren't we using Far-UVC everywhere? Why isn't it in this room to prevent the spread of viruses and bacteria if it's indeed as effective and safe as the academics would have it? Well, part of the problem, the one that I'm going to focus on first and that we focused on in our research, is that we don't have effective emitters in these wavelengths. We use the higher ones because we know how to generate them with relatively cheap mercury lamps. For the wavelengths 200 to 230 nanometers, we only have these excimer lamps that are generally quite large, but the form factor is not the main problem. The main problem is simply that the cost per watt is too large to bear for most spaces or institutions that could realistically adopt it, whether it's hospitals or schools or cruise ships. And so and the just the simple power output that you can get out of them is also quite low. So my colleagues Esper and Vivian tried to get a broad exposure to the field, reading up on the literature and also attending all conferences and interviewing experts. And initially, we thought that this would be a very long process to get to something that meets the criteria and could be adopted quite broadly with lower cost. We focused on new materials for LEDs that could provide a relatively cheap solid state and manufacturable way of getting these wavelengths. Those are some examples: aluminum gallium nitride, or completely novel materials. And we were entertaining the idea of incubating a focused research organization that would specifically search over the space of materials to find the ones that generate the right wavelengths purely and effectively. And we thought that this would be the rate limiting step because the development timelines seemed quite long, and generally this is quite capital intensive. But again, nature and engineers have a nice surprise for us. There is apparently this magic that you can do with lasers, where you pass them through some particular crystal, where if two photons meet, their frequency doubles, or in other words, wavelength gets halved. And given that we have lasers that operate in 450 nanometers, we already get, if we apply this frequency doubling process, we get a very efficient source in 225 nanometers, which is in the range that we're looking for. And there is a company called Ubiquity that thinks that they can commercialize this in 2 years. So this was something that was roughly on our radar in the beginning, but we weren't sure how promising it would be. And we concluded that hardware is probably not going to be the rate limiting step for ultraviolet adoption. And at the same time, we noticed that there is far less progress than we would have hoped on putting together large-scale epidemiology and safety trials that would provide a greater evidence base that would make us all confident that indeed, if we expose ourselves to this ultraviolet light, it wouldn't cause any problems, and also that it would be effective for reducing the R naught of a pandemic pathogen substantially. So we went back to to our road mapping table, so to speak, and refocused on this problem, and this is where we are currently putting most of our effort. We are I'm right after this conference. I'm flying out to New York, where we are organizing a workshop on hardware with physicists and industry experts. But this is more of a wrap up of this work. Because we believe that this is quite easily solvable and doesn't require a focused research organization, whereas we think that it's quite likely that given existing funding structures, this research will not happen. So just to give you a flavor of the safety data that is currently missing that we would like to see. First of all, we would like to see more data on safety at higher intensities. Because the threshold limits or the exposure limits have been recently raised, but essentially the more intensity, the better for inactivating viruses and bacteria. There are open questions in terms of secondary air chemistry. How much ozone does it generate? Does it damage materials? Are all skin types really safe against it? And real-world efficacy data, this also didn't convert well, but we are ideally looking for a large-scale study that would isolate a relatively large number of people and in a double-blind fashion show whether there are effects over 2 to 4 weeks on how many people get infected in an isolated group. Oil rigs seem like a particularly promising context here to develop this. So a sketch of a focused research organization that we are currently thinking about would be one that focused over 5, at most 7 years on putting together the most comprehensive data set on these two approaches and help accelerate the field in this way. So just very briefly, even if we do find a really good idea, we still have to go through a due diligence process because philanthropic funding isn't unlimited, and we have to make the case for why this couldn't be implemented in a startup context or in existing funding structures, say NIH or National Science Foundation in the US. And then, of course, we evaluate the different merits of the proposed project. An important one here is just how good of a team can we find to execute the project. Is someone willing to leave academia, for instance, for 5 years, or is there some arrangement like that? That is the most typical way we do things. And then we can pitch it to our philanthropic partners. So over a longer term, I think we would love to extend this approach to other key fields of differential technology development where there are potential risks or large-scale benefits that aren't well addressed by current incentive structures. This could include under-incentivized AI safety research or long-term nanotechnology development. There was supposed to be an emoji. Unfortunately, we are not hiring at the moment, but I'm always keen to talk with people who are interested in this topic from essentially any direction. There is a lot of skill sets that are needed, and thank you for your attention, and looking forward to your questions. I'm sticking around for another 30 minutes if anyone's interested in talking.